Now for the second half of the program. You may have noticed the signs around campus asking, what is creativity? Or heard people talking about Barb Shine and Lena Lamentina's class in creative problem solving, and wondered what this is all about. Many of you have heard me speak about the difficulty we face in education today, having a new generation of students strong in standardized testing, but weak in thinking. For me, the fear of missing an opportunity to help this generation develop the skills needed to succeed in the 21st century and to be the informed citizens that Jefferson said were needed for a democracy is overwhelming. Accordingly, I was so happy when Lena introduced me to the International Center for Studies in Creativity at Buffalo State College. It was there last spring that myself, Barb Shine, Lena, Karen Kovac-Allen, and Rick Dunkowski had the pleasure to spend some time meeting with administrators and faculty. Today's speaker, Dr. Gerard Puccio, is the department chair of the center and one of its originators. Dr. Puccio is a noted author, speaker, and consultant. His clients include Fisher-Price Brands, Sun Life Insurance, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, Kraft Foods, New Jersey Institute of Technology, and SUNY FIT. He has held workshops and presentations in many foreign countries, including France, England, Spain, Italy, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Canada. Dr. Puccio holds a PhD in organizational psychology from the University of Manchester in the UK. He has agreed to speak to us about creativity and his work in the area. Help me welcome Dr. Gerard Puccio.
It's a pleasure to be here, and while we're waiting for the technology to come up, I'm going to tell you the backstory behind the introduction, and I don't normally do this, but I think in a moment you'll find out why. If you reflect back on your life, I'm sure you can think of moments in your life where you made a decision or you had an experience that changed the trajectory of your life. I have that experience. And that experience involved the community college, Jamestown Community College. I'm a graduate of JCC. Back in 1980, I went off to Penn State. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I had a very poor experience. I thought, I'm not satisfied. What am I going to do? I'm not happy where I am. And a friend of mine who graduated a year after me from high school, who was also on the wrestling team that I was on, was planning on going to Jamestown Community College. And he said, you know, they have an excellent wrestling program there. They're in the top 20 in the US. I happened to talk to the coach when I was there visiting JCC, and he's very much interested in you. Why don't you come along and check it out? And I did. And that decision completely altered the course of my life. Because it was at JCC that I came across the first course I had ever taken in creativity. My academic advisor had a whole series of courses that were focused on how do you help students to be better creative thinkers so that they could be more skillful in solving life's problems. So after a year of being on the wrestling team, I evolved into a student leader. I was on the board of trustees. I was vice president on the student senate. And those experiences gave me the confidence to pursue higher education. So it's a pleasure, I have to tell you, it's a pleasure to be here at a SUNY campus and at a community college. Because the backstory is, the introduction that you heard all started because of community college. So the work that you do is crucially important. It's also a pleasure to be here because as I've looked at your strategic plan, and as you heard Dr. Sundar talk about this morning, it's critical, especially in the 21st century, as we think about preparing students to join the 21st century, that we assist them in readying themselves for a world full of change. So as you look externally to the community and thinking about helping students to join that kind of community, I also appreciate the fact that the strategic plan talks about building a culture of trust, collaboration, and innovation. And I heard from the president this morning an openness to hear your ideas, recognizing that the success of this organization is going to rely in large part on the ideas that come forward within the community. So the goal of my presentation today is to share with you some of the trends around life in the 21st century and to help you to be aware of the kind of world we're sending our students into, but to also help you to be thinking about what is innovation and how do we as a community embrace and help to drive innovation. So that's the focus. You should have a handout with the PowerPoint. It does not have all of the 833 slides I'm going to show you. It has some of the key slides, and the PowerPoint is up. Great. So, it's nice to be at a fellow SUNY institution. Dr. Bellinger talked about all the travel that I do. It's nice to go on a 45-minute drive as opposed to a 17-hour flight to Taiwan that I was on recently. But some of you might wonder, SUNY, great system, but why would the International Center for Study and Creativity be in Buffalo? International, galactic Center for Creativity in Buffalo. Shouldn't it be in New York City or Chicago, San Francisco, a more cosmopolitan city? Well, there's a reason why, and often when you look at organizations, you can tie the organization to a visionary. And the visionary for whom we can thank for having this international center in Buffalo is this gentleman here, Alex Osborne. And I'll tell you a little bit of story about Alex Osborne. Alex Osborne is a famous, well-known Western New Yorker. How many of you have ever heard of this famous Terry that graduated from Buffalo State? You should. A few hands went up. That's good. Famous Western New Yorker, Alex Osborne. He was a founding partner of an advertising firm called BBD&O, Batten, Barton, Bernstein, and Osborne. Now, you can imagine in advertising, in order to have fresh campaigns, to capture people's attention, creative thinking and imagination would be extremely important. And so Osborne felt that you didn't have to leave imagination just up to chance, that you could provoke in deliberate ways imagination. And so he developed some methods which he tested and found to be highly successful in his advertising firm, which was based in New York City. And then to share that with the world, he wrote a book called Applied Imagination, which was on the New York Times bestseller list. So this famous New Yorker, Western New Yorker, who was from Buffalo, Alex Osborne, wrote a very popular book translated into about a dozen different languages, Applied Imagination. Now, who's ever heard of Applied Imagination? This famous New York Times bestseller. Okay. Let me try one more attempt here. Osborne, in this book, shared the methods that he had developed, one of which I'm sure you've all heard of. In this book, he introduced to the world the thinking tool called brainstorming. It was invented by a Buffalonian and has now gone around the world. How many of you have ever heard of brainstorming? Good. So connecting the dots. Osborne, visionary, advertising partner, wrote this book, would challenge the conception that creativity was something you were just born with, but it's something that you could develop. He was a businessman. And he recognized as a businessman that to be successful professionally, you had to be a creative thinker. Because in the workplace, we're constantly challenged by problems that do not have easy answers. He had a concern, though. And his concern was that American education often did little to prepare future employees to be creative thinkers. And so his dream was to bring a more creative trend to American education. He felt that in some ways, education did more to undermine imagination than to promote it. And he felt it was a crucial life skill and professional skill. So as a result of his vision, he founded our department. It was founded in 1967. Sad part of the story is he passed away the very same year the department was finally established at Buffalo State College. So a little bit about this International Center for Studies in Creativity. We offer a Master of Science degree in Creativity, 33 credit hour degree program. We also offer a certificate in Creativity and Change Leadership. Because of the reputation of our department, 11 years ago, we began offering our graduate degree programs and the certificate program to distance learners, and we now enroll literally people from all around the world. And we have over, it says nearly 400, we now have over 400 alumni of our graduate program. We also do undergraduate courses. We have a minor concentration in creativity and one in leadership as well. So the flow for the keynote, here's what I'd like to cover with you this morning in an hour that I have. I'd like to talk about life in the 21st century. You already heard Dr. Bellinger refer to this and the pace of change. I'm going to look at some of the trends that underscore the need for creative thinking. I'll conclude this discussion of trends by specifically focusing on educational trends and some of the policies that are now coming out and some of the comments that are coming out from thought leaders with respect to education. Near the end of the presentation, I'll give you a definition, working definition of creativity, and if we have time, I'll involve you in an exercise that will challenge you to be creative. And then we'll have some time at the very end for some reflection and Q&A. How's that sound? I'm glad, because you really don't have a choice this evening. So, life in the 21st century. One of the things that I enjoy doing is looking at the trends. What's happening in society? So I'm going to cover a few that underscore the need for creative thinking and innovation. So we're going to look at trends in society as a whole, specifically in business, and at the end, education. So one of the things that you hear that's tossed around a lot, that the speed of change is faster in the 21st century than ever before. But what does that really mean? Let me give you some statistics to support that. Example. In the 2,000 years before 1800, so the 2,000 years before 1800, according to Jane Henry, management and business expert in the UK, there were a total of 10, get this, 10 technical and social inventions that fundamentally altered how people lived their lives. 10 in 2,000 years. In the last 200 years, there have been more than 25 life-altering technical social inventions. So it would have been possible, let's say you were born in the 13th century, to live your life without having to adapt your life to one significant social or technical invention. Sounds kind of nice, doesn't it? So what were some of those? Let me give you some examples. Between 200 BC and 1800 AD, we had the invention of the clock, the compass, steam engine, and this is timely, political parties. Oh God. I'm not saying these are all good. Between 1800 and today, the car, the airplane, nuclear power, credit cards, space travel, wide use of fertilizers, the invention of the mobile phone, the computer, fax machine, development of chemicals, wide use of pharmaceuticals, and so forth. That's life today. And it will continue to accelerate. I'm sure you've all experienced this, especially in the area of technology. You know that when you go to buy a computer, as you're walking out of the computer store, that it's already out of date, right? Or last October, a year ago October, I finally bought one of those 3D televisions. I've been holding on for a long time, so I bought this mammoth, huge, 57, 55-inch, I forget, flat screen, 3D television. I'm all excited that I've got this 3D television, no one with the goggles. And the next week, I hear on NPR that Apple had patented 3D technology without goggles. I should have waited. Speaking specifically of products, let me go over a second trend: shorter product life cycles. There was a day when you could have gone to work, maybe your grandfather, and you could have spent your career basically working on the same product. That's not what it's like today. Manufactured products are subject to fundamental redesign every 5 to 10 years. In technology, get this, I just talked about televisions and computers. High-tech products undergo fundamental redesign every 6 to 12 months. Busy trying to keep up. What's the impact on organizations? Tremendous. I'll give you 2 examples. Going back to the 20th century, Wrigley Gum, get this, for almost 60 years in the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, Wrigley Gum produced the same 3 flavors for 60 years. Have you looked at the gum racks recently in the grocery store? And this is an interesting story about Motorola, that under a paragraph, you get the sense for the impact of these shorter product life cycles on organizations. Motorola, heroic and innovative pioneer of cell phone at first, then scorned failure when it didn't jump onto digital phones, then reborn champion when it created the sleek Razor, which you see here, then goat once again when it couldn't produce a successor, was finally a casualty of competition with its decision to unload its cell phone business completely. One of the originators of the cell phone business, and they had to give up that line of products altogether. That's the world we're sending our students in. More broadly, erosion of permanent stable work life. When looking at what our future holds for students and what they can expect in their work lives. According to U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, kids in school today can anticipate that when they join the workforce between the age of 18 and 42, they will change their jobs 11 times. And they stopped the prediction there because they weren't confident that they could predict beyond the age of 42. So what's that going to feel like? Let's experience an experience. I'm going to involve you in an experience that looks at change. So here's where we go from passive learning to active learning. Are you ready? Okay. So it's pretty simple. We're going to go through this slide. We'll go through it twice. The first time we're going to go through it, we're going to read the words that you see on the screen, starting in the top left-hand corner. And I will pace you. And every time I clap my hand, we'll move to the next word. Okay? Sound simple enough? Okay, great. So the first word that you see top left-hand corner is the word green. Okay, next. Red, blue, green, blue, yellow, orange, red, black, blue, red, green, red, blue, green, red. Some of you really tried to keep up. I'd love to keep up. Okay, remember I said as we send students into the workforce, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're going to change jobs 11 times before they reach the age of 42. Often this will come without any kind of announcement, and they'll have to adjust quickly to this change. In this case, I'm going to tell you you're going to have to change. So you're prepared, right? So you're prepared. You should be able to adapt without any problem, right? Because you've been prepared. This time when we go through, rather than saying the word, you're going to tell me the color of the word. So you've been forewarned. You've been forewarned about what the nature of the change is. So rather than saying green, you're actually saying blue. Oh, great, you got it. It's simple. Okay. So, top left corner, we're going to start with that one. That is blue, green, yellow, blue, red, yellow, blue, green, red. It's not so easy. It's not so easy, and you at least had the luxury of being warned. This is what our students are going to face. Imagine going into a world where you may be facing the proposition of changing jobs 11 times, or your organizations having to go through fundamental change in order to survive. You know Nokia, cell phone company? They started as a boot manufacturing company. In order to survive today, organizations are going to have to continuously transform themselves. So if our students aren't changing jobs regularly, they're going to be working in organizations that will have to change to survive. So how well are we preparing our students for that kind of world? And the very nature of work is changing. In 1991, we left the industrial age. Expenditures related to the industrial age were surpassed in 1991 by expenditures related to the knowledge age. According to economist Richard Florida, in 1900, less than 10% of the U.S. population worked in creative jobs. Jobs that required imagination. Jobs that required one to engage in higher order abstract thinking. In 100 years, that went up by 20%. 1/3 of the jobs, roughly, in the U.S. in the year 2000 demanded creative thinking. Some would argue that we've left the knowledge age and we're now in the innovation age. According to economist Jansen, after the age of efficiency in the 1950s and 60s, quality in the 70s and 80s, and flexibility in the 80s and 90s, we now live in an age of innovation. It's all throughout your strategic plan. You heard innovation mentioned this morning. More than 70% of senior executives report that innovation is going to be the top 3 drivers of growth going forward. 88% of the organizations in the U.S. have the word innovate or innovation in their mission or vision. In the pharmaceutical industry, it's 100% of the organizations in the pharmaceutical industry have innovate or innovation in their mission statement. Rhetorical question: how well are we preparing our students to join these organizations that see innovation as a key strategic driver of growth? In a book called Partnership for the 21st Century, Trilling and Fatal talk about the nature of the workplace, and they say that in more developed countries, there is clearly a focus on creative work, work in which the employees are required to engage in expert thinking and problem solving. In less developed countries, there's still more of a focus on routine work. As a consequence, the kinds of skills that employers are looking for that are on the rise: complex communication and expert thinking, abstract reasoning and problem solving. What's on the decline is routine manual and routine cognitive skills. Time Magazine last January, in terms of looking towards the future, and we look at job growth, if we go out to 2012, for the first time, those who have bachelor's degree will outpace those with high school degrees in terms of getting new jobs. First time in history. One of the other significant trends that's a massive game changer is the World Wide Web. The exponential increase in content and its ubiquitous availability is going to change all industries. Let's look at some data points around this. Mahaffey, in his presentation a year ago, said that content doubles every 18 months on the internet. We look at one example, YouTube. In 2006, YouTube posted 65,000 new videos every 24 hours. Today, you can't see it, but I think it says 2 billion videos are viewed per day. My children account for about 1 billion. So let's wrap this up by looking at a final trend in education. Education now recognizes that creative thinking is an essential 21st century skill. So all of the previous trends that I just shared with you build up to this point. That there are thought leaders, national thought leaders in the area of education that are crying out for educational institutions to do more to enhance the creative thinking of students so that they are better prepared to join this kind of world. For example, to look at the Secretary's Commission on Necessary Skills, which was managed and overseen by the federal government, they were looking into the new millennium and anticipating what are the kinds of skills that all employees will need, students will need as they join the workforce. They said that these skills will fall into 3 areas. I've highlighted the second area. Really love this term, thinking skills. In the industrial age, where employees were machinery, parts were working within a larger machine, they didn't have to think. But that's not the case in the 21st century. The specific skills that fall into this category, thinking creatively, making decisions, solving problems, seeing things in the mind's eye, knowing how to learn, and reasoning. Process skills, metacognitive skills, higher order thinking skills. 21st century skills, learning for a life in our time. This is the title of the book. They also identify 3 areas. The very first area that they talk about in this book is learning and innovation skills. I mentioned earlier a statistic that 88% of the organizations in the U.S. have innovation in their mission statement. But you know what? Talk can be cheap. Having a mission or a vision in the website or on the wall is nice. But a follow-up study found out that only 5% of those 88% actually did anything to promote creativity actively in their organizations. Sometimes I worry that we get caught up in the buzzwords. The rest of the world's talking about innovation. We better start talking about innovation. But are we really doing something about it? So as we think about preparing students to join these kinds of organizations, according to this book, an area that we need to focus on in our educational practices is helping students in this area, learning and innovation skills, which include things like problem solving and specifically creativity and innovation. Digital literacy, of course, is going to be important. And in the third area, they talk about career and life skills, which includes flexibility and adaptability, which are well-known traits of creative people. And they also talk about leadership. And I would argue that leadership in the 21st century, given the pace of change, a core competence of effective leaders who are going to help their organizations navigate through complexity has got to be creativity. Harvard Business Review wrote a wonderful article on leadership a couple years ago. And this said, this was in the middle of the recession, although I'm hoping that was the middle then. They said that it's a fallacy to think that the crisis is over. That in the 21st century, leading organizations means contending with one crisis after the other. And I would suggest that if that is the case, then leaders need to be creative thinkers as well. From a book called New Commission on Skills of the American Workforce, I'll give you a quote that underscores how these authors see the role of creativity. They say that creativity, innovation, and flexibility will not be the special province of an elite. It will be demanded of virtually everyone who's making a decent living. From graphic artists to assembly line workers, from insurance brokers to home builders. No matter what profession you're in, you'll need to be a visionary, a forward thinker, a flexible thinker. So the question is, and this is a rhetorical question, how well do schools prepare students to join this world? If you saw Time magazine, no, it was Newsweek a couple of years ago, cover article, The Creativity Crisis in America. We often talk about how when we look at math scores and reading scores, the U.S. doesn't stack up well against other countries. But when you also look at measures of creativity, we're starting to slip as well. And that's what this cover article was about. That if you look at normative measures of creativity that have been around for about 40 years, we're entering a period of all-time lows. So how well are we doing to prepare students for the 21st century? According to educational expert Mark Runco, most educational efforts emphasize convergent thinking. The notion that there's a single right answer. And that all you have to do to be successful is to give that answer to your teacher. Wouldn't it be nice if life were that simple? If all the problems we contended with had that right answer. Runco goes on to say that, and therefore may do very little, if anything, for creative potential. A bit tougher language from another book. Our schools on the whole are hostile to ideas. Too often, our tests ask students to come up with the one right answer, and the curriculum, head to the test, penalizes the creative student rather than rewarding him or her for the unexpected but thoughtful or even brilliant response. Where would we be if Steve Jobs only looked for the right answer? It's innovation that drives our economy and sustains our society. This slide underscores what I call the perfect storm. This was a study done by the Society for Human Resource Management. They interviewed HR managers across the U.S. and they asked, when you look to hire a new entrant, what skills are most important? What are you looking for? And these were the skills that once they analyzed that data, they came up with. These 14 what they call applied skills. This is the list of skills here you see in the right column. Now, the percentage that you see in the right column, that percentage represents the answer to a follow-up question, which was, if you hire someone and they don't have this skill, how well prepared are you to enhance that skill in that new hire? How well prepared are you if there's a gap? Almost 70% of the HR managers they interviewed said, you know what, creativity is really, really, really important. And if we hire someone and we don't think that they excel at creative thinking, 70% of the HR managers said, we're not well prepared to develop that skill. That's a perfect storm. If as educators, we're not developing that skill, and HR managers are saying they're not prepared to develop that skill, but success in the 21st century demands that skill, where does that leave the student? Where does that leave the new hire? So that's my case for the importance and the relevance of creativity for the 21st century. Now let's talk a bit about what creativity is. I've thrown the term around. I've not defined it. The scientific study of creativity has been in existence for 60 years. If you ever visit Buffalo State College, we have the world's largest collection of books on creativity. We have 4,000 books in our library. There are 7 refereed journals in the field of creativity. It's an established science. So let me share with you a few definitions from this field of study. Definition I came across when I did my doctoral work that has always stuck with me. Creativity is the ability to modify self-imposed constraints. The ability to modify self-imposed constraints. Where creative thinking starts is with us as an individual. Certainly our culture and the climate that we work in has an influence, but it begins with us. We often do things to ourselves that undermine our ability to engage in creative thinking. And I want to explore one of these ways. And again, this is designed to keep you awake. You're going to be engaged in the presentation. So, Dr. Bellinger told me that you all really enjoy complex math problems. So I have a math problem that I have you work on. It's really not that complex. It's just addition. So we're going to do some math. I'm going to bring up a series of numbers. I want you to shout out the sum, the total, as we go along. I don't have time to write this down because we're going to move pretty quickly. And this is really not going to be that complicated. But to be sure that we're all starting in the same place. Can you see that number? No. Okay, good. The number is yellow. Change the paradigm of what number means. In my world, that's 1,000. Okay, so shout out not the number, but the total of the numbers when you add them together. So the total is 1,000. Great. Okay, the total now? Total? 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 We got some variation in our responses there. Now, the arithmetic solution is 4,100. The predominant response I heard, now I know you didn't say it, but the people sitting next to you, because it wasn't you, it was your neighbors said it. What did you hear them say? 5,000. A 6,000 got whispered in there. And I've only ever had that happen once, actually, and that was last summer. I was working with a European bank. With the top 100 executives. And I heard a predominant response of 6,000. Now, maybe they were thinking in euros, not dollars, I don't know, but that bank's been in the news lately. And they're not doing well. So what happened here? What happened here? Most of us said 5,000, and don't feel bad because you know what? I've been doing this for 20 years, and that's what most people say, is 5,000. Here's what happened. I got you into a pattern. And our minds, our brains, the way they work is that they seek patterns. They seek patterns because when we find a pattern and we get comfortable with the pattern, it allows us to focus our effort in other places. It's called habits. So I created a pattern that got you into a habitual way of thinking. In this exercise, you're working with 2-digit places, thousands and tens. Until I got to this number, because when this number was added in, it introduced something that didn't fit the pattern, the hundreds place. And because it didn't fit the pattern, what did your mind naturally do? It forced it to fit the pattern. You ignored that piece of novelty. And how long did it take for me to create that pattern? Seconds, right? Seconds. So as you're being challenged by the president of this institution, as you look at your strategic plan that calls for innovation, it requires you to challenge some of your patterns and past practices. In 5 seconds, I create a pattern, but those of you who've been here for a number of years, or a career, what past patterns and practices have you gotten into? In some cases, that will be very productive. But in other cases, it's time to allow those to evolve into something else, to see new opportunities. I'll tell you a story. It's a Buddhist story. And I'll tell you right now, it's a depressing story. The Buddhists do say life is about suffering. And this is only a metaphor. But here's how the story goes, and I think it's a powerful story. There's a widower. He has a young son. He's a wealthy man. He loves his son dearly. His son is the center of his life. And one day, this wealthy merchant had to conduct business in a neighboring town. And so he had to leave his son. He went off to conduct business. And while he was away, some bandits came to his village and to his street and saw his home and recognized that this home must have been owned by someone wealthy. So they came to the home, they rampaged through the home, they stole items out of the home, and they found the son. And they kidnapped this man's son. And being the mean, evil people they were, they burned the house down just for good measure. They took the son away. That evening, in the dark, the father returned home, came to a street and looked to the end of the street, and he saw that his house had been burned to the ground. He ran to the house, and close to the house were the remains of a small boy, unrecognizable. And he assumed that that boy was his son. He rebuilt his home and he went on with his life, but he lived in sorrow because he thought his son was dead, not knowing that his son actually had been kidnapped. Some months had gone by, and in the dark of night, the son was able to escape from the bandits. And he returned to his village and to his street and saw that the house had been rebuilt. Went to his father's house, and in the middle of the night began knocking on the door. The door was locked, he couldn't enter. Father, Father, I'm home. The father called back, stop teasing me. I know it's you, the children from the neighborhood, making fun of my sorrow. Leave me alone. And the boy knocked louder. Father, Father, it's me, let me in. And he said, no, go away, I can't take any more of this torment. Please leave me alone. And the boy tried again and again and got the same response. And eventually, being greatly disappointed, not being allowed into his father's home, he left. I told you it's a pretty depressing story. But it's a metaphor. And the Buddhists tell that story because they want to underscore that if you come to a conclusion or an insight, and that becomes your truth, you miss other opportunities. Even when those opportunities come knocking and banging on your door. So how well do we help our students to be flexible thinkers? To recognize that the answer today may not be the answer tomorrow. What is truth today may not be truth tomorrow. Sometimes the only exercise the mind gets is slamming itself closed. And we miss opportunities, just as we did in this exercise when the number 10 came up. We missed that piece of knowledge. So, in this definition, creativity is the ability to modify self-imposed constraints. There's this word ability. Creativity is like any other ability. How many of you play or have ever played a musical instrument? Oh, wow, really good percentage. How many of you have been involved or are currently involved in athletic endeavors? How about hobbies, committed to a hobby that you practice regularly? Wow, great. So you'll be able to answer this question. How do you develop mastery in any of those areas, or proficiency? Practice. Always get that. That was really good too. That was in practice. What else do you do to develop mastery or proficiency?
Repetition.
Say it again.
Repetition.
Repetition. So practice, repetition, study. How about work with a coach? Yeah, have a mentor, get feedback, think about your performance. The same thing is true for creativity. Wonderful book I'd recommend called Talent is Overrated. Jeffrey Colton came out a few years ago. Talent is Overrated. The book talks about the principle of those people who become masters are not masters in their professions because of their innate talent, some gift they had because of DNA. They became masters because of deliberate practice. And creativity is the same way. When we say creativity is an ability, it's an ability that all people have. You're human, you're creative. That is what makes us different from other species. We have the ability to create our own worlds. As any other ability, people will vary in regard to how much creativity they have. We're not all Edisons, we're not all Martin Luther Kings, Maya Angelos. We will vary in how much creativity we have. But the good news is, and this is important for educators, whatever your level of creativity, it can be enhanced. At its core, creativity is a thinking and emotional skill that can be developed through training, through practice, through coaching, through feedback, through learning strategies. There are 70 empirical studies in refereed journals, scholarly studies, that all conclude the same thing. You can train people to be more successful creative thinkers. It's like any other area of ability. The most common definition of creativity, the one most widely accepted in literature, is that creativity is the production of original ideas that are made useful. So creativity is not just about being different, about being bizarre. It's producing new thinking that serves a value, that solves a problem, that makes your life better or someone else's life better. And innovation, a word that's being thrown around a lot today, innovation is the successful introduction of new useful ideas, according to Teresa Mobley of Harvard. So without creative thinking, we don't get innovation. Innovation just doesn't happen. It has to first start with someone applying his or her imagination. Just because you say you want to be innovative doesn't automatically mean it's going to happen. An organization that is not idea-rich, an organization that is excellent at killing ideas, will not be innovative. Industrial research studies show that in order to get to one successful market innovation, it takes 3,000 initial product concepts to get to one successful innovation in the marketplace. You have to be an idea-rich organization to be an innovative organization. So, that brings us, and we have time, aren't we lucky? We have time to test your creativity. So you need something to write with and something to write on. If you don't have those resources, borrow from a neighbor. Write the 3 most creative sentences you can think of using the following 3 words. So your goal is to come up with 3 interesting sentences, 3 creative sentences. How will we know that you've achieved that goal? At the end of this exercise, you're just going to turn to a neighbor and you're going to have an audience. You're going to share your sentences with your neighbor, and if they respond with a smile or a laugh or, gee, that's fantastic, then you've accomplished the goal. So we're going to use someone else to kind of validate whether you came up with an interesting, intriguing, creative sentence. Now, creativity always happens with constraint. Because we don't have unlimited resources or time. So the constraint in each sentence, I want you to use these 3 words. So every sentence must include round, yellow, and sour. Round, yellow, and sour. So you have to find a way to connect those 3 words in a meaningful way in your sentences. And the goal at the end of it is to come up with the 3 most creative sentences you can think of. Make sense? Okay, go. Doing this individually, write this on your PowerPoint handout or someplace else. I don't want time to limit you, so keep working. When you're satisfied that you've met the goal, that you have achieved the goal that you see on the slide, put your pen down and look up so I know that you're done. And when most folks are done, we'll stop. And we'll move on. you satisfied you reached the goal? Yeah? I'm hearing whispers, so I'm assuming most of you are done, or you're getting cues from a partner. So what I'd like to do is just, everyone here, turn to someone you're sitting near. You might have to slide over a few seats and make sure you're talking to someone. I'd like you to share your sentences with a partner. Let's see how they respond. Why we do this exercise is sometimes getting people to think creatively is as simple as asking them to do it. The other reason why I did this exercise is that did you notice the energy in the room? And this was a simple, fun, light task. But did you notice the energy in the room as soon as you started to share? Did you hear the buzz? This is universal. When we engage in our creativity, we learn new things about ourselves. We experience our own humanity. I once, as an assignment, asked undergraduate students, they were required to keep a journal, and I posed this question to them. I said, why do you think it's important that we study creativity? And I'll never forget this. One young man wrote in his journal, the reason why I believe it's important to study creativity is because when we study creativity, we study ourselves. We study ourselves. And when we engage in creative thinking, we fulfill our potential. There's a buzz about it. And when we deny people the opportunity to think creatively, in a way, I think we deny them of their humanity. I worked in an automobile manufacturing plant for a short while, and I remember one time an employee came in and there was a problem with one of the machines, and the employee overheard a conversation with the supervisor, and the employee said, well, I got this idea, I was thinking about this overnight. And the supervisor turned to the employee and said, Bob, you're not paid to think. When you come to work, you leave your brain in the car. All I need is your brawn. The truth is, when we're able to engage in creative thinking, we do more to realize our potential. And unlike some of the stereotypes that being creative means you're eccentric, research actually shows that when you are able to exercise your creativity, it leads to better mental health. Because it puts you in a position to cope with life's complexities. It's a common comment that our graduates say about our degree. That when they leave our degree program, they feel much more confident to take on life. Because they know the greatest resource they had is here. The other reason why I do this exercise is to explore thinking. Now, I asked you to come up with the 3 most creative sentences you can think of. We're not often trained how to be good thinkers, especially good creative thinkers. Now, what most people do, and I don't know whether you did this or not, but what most people will do is they'll read this and they'll say, oh, the goal is to come up with the 3 most creative sentences I can think of. Okay, I'll give Dr. Puccio 3 sentences and I'll stop. The reality is, if you want to have a creative breakthrough, you have to generate lots of options. Far too often, we're taught to give the teacher exactly what the teacher wanted, to give the boss exactly what the boss wanted. The truth is, and research shows it over and over again, if you want to have a breakthrough, you have to be an effective divergent thinker. When you're posed a challenge, you need to be able to come up with lots of responses. How do you know the first 3 sentences you thought of are the 3 most creative sentences you could write? Why not write 12 and then choose the 3 most creative? Actually, research shows your first responses to a problem are generally the most ordinary responses. They're things you've already thought of. Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, 30-some plays. Picasso had 20,000 works of art. Nobel Prize winners published at a rate twice of non-winners. Steve Jobs had a lot of failures. If you want to have a breakthrough, you have to have lots of ideas. So that's another point behind the exercise. Now I'm coming to the end. I'm going to share some resources with you and with you. I haven't forgotten you. I have some good questions. But in the 5 minutes remaining, I will open up to any questions that you might have. Yes?
Yes, I know ideas have to be useful, but I think one of the things that makes somebody very creative is they are unafraid of failure.
Yep.
And failure is part of the process. And I think we're brought up from the time we're very young, given the examples you gave before, that 2 and 2 is 4 and 4 is 8. If you don't pass the SAT, you're not high enough score, you don't give the right answer to your question. And you have to be afraid to go, circumvent that and go around and be able to diverge into that and not be afraid that somebody's going to say, no, you're wrong. Well, okay, well, it's wrong. We're not raised that way.
Yeah. I hope everyone could hear that comment because that was a wonderful comment. I'll repeat it, at least part of it. I can't do justice to the full breadth of the comment that you made, but an important part of the creative process is being willing to experiment and to make mistakes. Edison, who was being interviewed by a young journalist, kind of brash journalist, who was trying to poke fun at Edison. This was late in his career. He was working on an invention, and he wasn't successful. He had tried many, many times, and I forget what he was working on, but the journalist said, "You're the most celebrated inventor in our country, and I know you're working on this project, and you failed now over and over and over again. How does that feel?" He was trying to poke fun at him. And Edison looked at him and said, "You know what, young man? You know very little about life. Because all of those failures now put me in a position to be that much closer to the solution." And one of my other favorite quotes is, "He who makes no mistakes usually makes nothing." And maybe you've heard of something called the 10,000-hour rule. It's become popularized in books like Pink's books and others books where they talk about eminently creative people or people who've had breakthroughs. And this comes from good research, the 10,000-hour rule, that it takes about 10,000 hours of really hard work before you get to a major breakthrough. Now, what happens during that 10,000 hours? Well, a lot of practice, obviously, but you know what? A lot of failure. And every time you fail, you're learning. The number one barrier to innovation in American corporations, according to CEOs, is a risk-averse culture. it's a risk-averse culture, you'll always do what you've always done. Because when you try new things, by virtue of being new and novel, the probability of failure goes up. But so also does the probability of breakthrough. Yes?
Eunice provided a link to your website, so I'll remember making some podcasts. Enjoyed this. And being a middle-aged kind of warrior, I'm probably some skeptical and so on.
Mark,
I'm
can you speak
reasonably
up?
creative. Here's the thing. How many
Little Doctor that wants you to speak up, so you might agree.
You've gone to all kinds of places and companies and RIT and so on and top. How many times have you talked to a legislator who said we have to have standardized tests every 10 weeks now instead of every 40 in the high school? How many times has this, because having lived in that world, part of my work here, much of my work here is to unteach. To put a candle at the bottom of the glacier, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it would be nice for us not to play the game we don't know where the problem emerges.
Right.
One of the problems, and actually address it. And it's not the teachers, always, no. And it's not always administrators, no. But it's the whole idea of we must converge for 12 years. And then they come here, and we have to undo it.
Right, right. The reality is, this concept is not universally embraced. The reality is also, I've been in this field for 28 years, and there's never been a wider recognition and open dialogue about this. So I can tell you, you mentioned glaciers, and you know, glaciers move pretty slowly. So it often feels that way to me. But I would also say to you, you know, it was one person who made a difference in my life. So while we have a society in which this is not universally embraced, what is leadership? Leadership is choosing to make a difference and not saying, I'm going to give up my power because everyone else is saying something to the contrary. But it's deciding to make a difference. And I would say that even if you're lighting that candle, get one person, one kid's mind to shed some of that indoctrination that person's been through. I think it's worth it for that child. So that's how a revolution starts, right? So, great question. I'll take one more question. Back here, gentleman in the white shirt.
Yes, I'm wondering if you see any potential dangers in an ability-centric approach to creativity, in the sense that what we're trying to accomplish is to give students a skill set. For example, which would you prefer? If we could, as an institution, increase the ability of every student in terms of creativity 50%, do nothing to touch the motivation, disposition to employ the skill, versus a 5% bump in their ability and a 50% increase in their disposition, their habit to employ the skill.
Well, I would say it's not an either-or choice. It's a yes and. In our book on creative leadership, we talk about the relationship between cognitive ability and your emotional disposition or your motivation. The two have to go hand in hand. And Ruth Noller, one of the founders of our department, it's been well documented, and you use the term motivation, that without tapping into intrinsic motivation and drive, while you may have the ability, you may not maximize that ability and that potential. So I don't see it as an either-or. We don't strictly focus on cognitive skills in our undergraduate or graduate program, but we recognize the importance of the disposition and the personality and the motivation as well. In fact, sustaining creativity over time involves three things: imagination, knowledge, and evaluation or critical thinking. It requires all three. And it's driven by one's attitude, one's motivation. So you might be high in knowledge, high in imagination, very good critical thinker, but if you don't have the willingness, you don't have the drive to apply it, then it's latent rather than realized potential. So if I was speaking strictly of ability and giving the impression that all we need to do is to focus on developing cognitive skills, then I misrepresented my position. So, and I think that's what you were pointing to, the threat of that.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Great. Well, we're at the end, and I will stick around for some questions. You have the opportunity a breakout session. We have 5 facilitators here for you to begin to kind of wrestle with, well, what does this mean for us? An opportunity to engage in dialogue and collaboration, which I know is part of the vision for this institution. I have with me 5 facilitators. If the 5 facilitators would stand up. I'm not going to introduce each one, but these are highly skilled facilitators. They're either graduates of our graduate program or have had enough hours to earn the certificate. These are professionals. We have someone who's a certified educator, someone who works in the financial sector, someone who holds a master's degree in economics from the United Kingdom. We have an HR manager in an architectural firm, and I'm not going to tell you who it is, but we have a former Marine officer. Okay, so don't mess with these facilities. So in terms of resources going forward, we have some books that if you are interested in following up, this is a book that we had second edition come out last year called Creative Leadership. It's all about how leadership today needs to embody creative thinking, and it goes through both the cognitive and the affective skills in order to be successful. Gives you tools, research, and stories in it. A popular press book that just came out called The Innovative Team, Unleashing Creative Potential for Breakthrough Results. It's a fable, it's written as a story, talks about a dysfunctional project team and how things are going wrong and how the supervisor was able to turn that team around. And I brought a copy along with me, and the gentleman who I said I had something for in the presentation, this copy of the book is for you. Response I've never had before. Some other resources. Someone mentioned, thank you very much for mentioning the website and the fact that we have free resources. We see part of our role is to be a clearinghouse for good information on creativity. So if you visit our website, you'll find 30 or 40 videos, YouTube videos that go into different tools and concepts around creativity. And I think that is, yeah, that brings us to the end. Thank you very much.
I'm going to be shameless, okay? Just to let you all know, as faculty and staff, our second CPS, Creative Problem Solving course, credit course, is starting in February. It's a 12-week, and I'd like to give you a heads up on it. It's Mondays and Wednesdays. Michaeline Dawson, who is our adjunct, who has a degree from Buff State, will be teaching that course for us. So we're excited, we're starting, we're evolving, we're not there yet, but I just want to give you a heads up that will be available for students Mondays and Wednesdays, 1:25 to 3:15. It's a 12-week class. So our last class went well. This is number 2. We're hoping to grow this whole thing. Okay? Also, Lena?
Also, I'm Lena Lamatine. I think I know most people here. I work over at the Best Center, and the breakouts that Dr. Puccio had referred to with our lovely facilitators will be taking place in the technology building. So please join us there. They begin at 11:15 and run until 12:30 today.
And just as I just want to kind of wrap this up and thank you, Dr. Puccio, for being here, but also to extend what I think, I truly hope will be a semester talking about creativity and talking about some of the things that Charles brought up or that Norm brought up. Kind of where do we really want to go with this? How do we take what is an incredibly important skill set and embed it in what we do, help students come to this and incorporate it into our lives as teachers and instructors. So there's a lot of conversation, a lot of things to do. The breakout sessions, I think you'll find really interesting. So if we could kind of, Lena, are we set up now to move right over there?
We are, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if you want to come over and we'll be done so that you can. I'm not done. I just.